Today we are talking about predator-prey relationships, specifically how prey evade their predators. Two major ways are refugia and avoidance. There are 5 major types of refugia: small scale and space threshold. Large scale refugia involves prey avoiding territories inhabited by predators. For example, in Africa, antelopes avoid lions by herding in areas far from the lions. An example of small scale refugia is flying fish. These fish avoid predators by launching themselves out of the water and then gliding and re-entering the water elsewhere. They can launch themselves up to 20 feet out of the water and glide for over 1,000 feet. One disadvantage to this is that the fish don't know if there will be another predator where they land, but overall, flying gives these fish an advantage. Space threshold is when prey adapt to survive in harsh or varying conditions to avoid predators. Time refugia is surviving by either temporal hiding or tolerance. For example, some birds time their breeding season to match that of their predators. This is known as reproductive periodicity. Both predator and prey populations are vulnerable at the same time, thus reducing the chances of the predator leaving their offspring to hunt. Another form of time refugia is predator satiation. Predator satiation is commonly used by insects and involves the insect laying a large quantity of eggs, knowing that while most won't survive, the small percent that does will be enough to maintain the species population.
A third type of refugia is size refugia. Size refugia is when animals mechanically manipulate into altering their sizes. This restricts the predator by limiting the capture efficiency and decreasing the rate of predator energy intake. Number refugia is survivorship via aggregation. To lessen the chance of predation, animals will stay and travel in larger groups. These groups include colony formation, schooling, and herding. Fish, for example, are less likely to be eaten when traveling in a school than if they're alone, because there's a power in numbers.
There is also number refugia for predator swamping. Predator swamping is when the predators respond to the prey density amount depending on whether their population fluctuates or decreases. An example would be the relationship between otters and sea urchins, because as the population of sea urchins increase, the probability of one individual being eaten by otters decreases.
The last type of refugia we're going to talk about is the ecology of fear. Fear of predation changes the behavior of prey that in turn affects the overall ecosystem. For example, when wolves are reintroduced into an area populated by deers, the fear of the wolves is enough to change the foraging behavior of the deer. The deer spend more time alert and isolated than before, and as a result, they consume less plants and the plant life around them flourishes.
A second way that prey evade predators are through different forms of avoidance. The first major type is defensive, in which animals protect themselves from predators with defenses such as body armor and spines. Crypsis is one form of defense in which prey avoid observation or detection. For example, this includes camouflage, nocturnality, subterranean lifestyle, and mimicry. Disruptive colorization and induced crypsis are forms of crypsis colorization. Detection interference helps avoid predation because animals can actually interfere with detection mechanisms from other predators. For example, tiger moths can jam the echo signal cries of bats, which leaves them undetectable.
Mimicry is when palatable or unpalatable species show similar physical features as fierce, toxic, or unpalatable species. The predators learn to avoid the unpalatable species, which is beneficial for the palatable and unpalatable species. There are 2 types of mimicry, which include Batesian and Mullerian. Countering all these ways that prey avoid predation, predators have found counter-adaptations. Predator-prey adaptations is when natural selection operates on predators to develop physical, physiological, and behavioral counter-adaptations for prey capture. An example of this would be when the Indian egg-eating snake dislocates its jaw to fit a whole egg in its mouth and into its body.
Mutualism. Mutualism is when two species interact and mutually benefit from that interaction. It is a positive relationship for the species involved. Why would species that could have a typical predator-prey relationship work together and choose a situation in which they mutually benefit? Mutualism occurs under a few different conditions: habitat limitation, a rich prey field, or intense predation from a shared predator.
Some examples of mutualistic relationships include that of the goby fish and the shrimp, anemone and clownfish, and the cactus plant and bat. The shrimp helps the goby by building a home in which they can both mutually inhabit.
But do these species need each other to survive? In mutualism, there are 2 species in this relationship. We have the facultative species, which is a species that can come together occasionally with the other, but does not need it to survive, so it can say goodbye whenever it wants to. Then we have the obligate species, which are species that need the other to survive. But does mutualism mean that the 2 species involved have to be either facultative or obligate? What if they are both facultative or both obligate? What would happen then? Let's take a look at the lockable term models. So, If both species were facultative, we have two scenarios. One scenario would model the runaway system, which is a positive feedback loop where the growth of one species enhances the growth of the other. The second scenario, the stable system, would be more restricted, for the growth of one of the species could upset the mutualistic balance and end up in a commensalism or predatory relationship. Now, in the obligate scenarios, we have, for the first one, the collapsing system, where the isocline would display how, without the interaction of species 1 with species 2, or vice versa, the population would go down. However, when they interact, their population increases. The second scenario, modeling the unstable system, would display a similar scenario as a stable system, but the plus negative negative sections would be flipped, thus exemplifying that with any change of population sizes, both species would be negatively affected one way or another.
Because not all mutualisms are obligate, some may come to an end. Under normal conditions, zooxanthellae establish colonies on corals, forming a mutualistic relationship. The corals utilize the organic matter and oxygen produced by the zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae utilize the habitat and CO2 provided by the corals. The corals rely on the zooxanthellae to survive, but the zooxanthellae do not require a coral to live, though it does increase their chance of survival. When the zooxanthellae leave, the corals die.
Symbiosis and mutualism are closely related concepts, but they are definitely not synonymous. For mutualism to be occurring, there must be a benefit to both species in exchange for their interaction. Symbiosis is a much more general term referring to two species interacting with each other with mixed results. Some think there is a gradient to symbiosis, in that not every interaction is purely positive or neutral for both species. This results in cases where species coexist and only one member benefits and the other is unaffected. The big takeaway here is that mutualism can only be occurring if both interacting species benefit from their relationship.
Katie Satko and Jion Ryu present Species Diversity, Lecture 21. Diversity is very important. Two places that we mentioned in class were the alpine desert and the tropical rainforest. The alpine desert may not look very diverse, but it really is. There are so many species you can find, as well as in the tropical rainforest. Another example we talked about in class are the kelp forests and the urchin barrens. Look at how different the kelp forest looks when it loses its keystone species. The diversity goes way down. Diversity hotspots are mostly near the equator. One famous one is in South America. Oceanic and coastal diversity occur mainly on the coasts. Although most mammal species are identified, most of the other world species are not, including insects. Only 20% of them are identified because they're so small we can't see them. They're really hard to find. Species diversity is basically the number of different species you have in an area. Effective number is a little more complicated, so let's take a closer look. So in this rainforest, you have a bag of marbles that represent the number of species you have. While it might be possible for you to count the number of marbles you have, you can't count the number of species in the rainforest. So you have to count it in samples. So those number of samples you take in order to count the number of species and diversity you have is basically what the effective number is. Richness, a term we've all heard before. So let's put it to use. How many species are there? Good job, there's 5. The more even a species is, the closer the ratio between the species will be 1 to 1.
For alpha diversity, you can basically count the number of species in your habitat. And gamma diversity is how various the species are in a larger landscape. Beta diversity is how alike the communities are. For example, this figure is very diverse because each colors represent different communities. One big color patch would mean very not diverse. Richness refers to a count of different species in a given ecosystem. Shannon quantifies the uncertainty of an individual species' identity if randomly taken from its dataset. And Simpson quantifies the probability of the two individuals randomly taken from the dataset being equal species. The smaller the subsample taken from the whole population is, the more likely the species diversity is to be underestimated in the area. Disturbance can disrupt the number of species and are either caused by nature or humans. We often think that disturbance is harmful because it's damaging to the individuals, but it actually creates opportunities for new individuals to join in. So it's not all negative as it sounds. Mature or stable community leaves little room for new species to join the community. Disturbed community, however, creates ample rooms for new species to take over the unoccupied new land. Rate of colonization increases as new settlers come in. This hypothesis basically says that the diversity is most abundant when there are an adequate amount of disturbance happening in the nature. But what happens if we add humans in the picture? Basically, the changes we have done to the environment are almost permanent because we don't move out once we establish ourselves in the area, that the disturbances do not allow the species to switch in between alternatives. This long-named hypothesis basically says that the less varied species there are, removing one species is critical to the ecosystem, but having too much is only redundant and adds nothing to the population either.
This lecture is on primary production and nutrient cycling. Before we begin, some important background terms to know are that the pool is the total amount of a nutrient in a component of the ecosystem. Flux is the temporal rate of input and output of a nutrient. The mean residence time is the amount of time on average that one molecule spends in the pool, and the turnover rate should be the flux rate divided by the pool, which should equal 1 over the residence time. Over the past few centuries, humans have undeniably altered our planet in numerous ways. Here you can see the Keeling curve, which shows the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide since the 1960s. Carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus are all cycled through ecosystems in similar ways. It's important to understand how, in order to make sense of how we're impacting these cycles. The majority of carbon on the planet is in the oceans, with only 1% being in the air. Dissolved carbon dioxide is sequestered by marine primary producers, which are eaten by marine consumers, which convert soluble carbonate ions into insoluble ocean sediments by depositing carbon in their shells and skeletons. Their soft bodies are decomposed into detritus, at which point carbon can be dissolved back into the oceans and made available for primary producers again. The nitrogen cycle looks pretty similar. Nitrogen fixation is done by microbes, which convert nitrogen gas to inorganic nitrogen, but it can also be done more spectacularly by lightning, and by humans, as we'll mention later. Ammonification is when bacteria and fungi convert urea and amino acids to ammonia gas. Nitrification is the conversion of ammonia to water-soluble nitrates done by bacteria, and denitrification is when bacteria do the opposite and convert nitrates to nitrites, and eventually back to gas. The phosphorus cycle is important, as it's the element that often limits net primary production in freshwater. Similar to the carbon and nitrogen cycles, a tiny amount of atmospheric phosphorus is dissolved into the ocean, where it can be absorbed by primary producers, which are absorbed by consumers, which eventually decompose. Important inputs into the ocean are by dust storms and seabird guano. Humans have altered these cycles a lot. We've increased atmospheric carbon dioxide by 30% in the industrial age using fossil fuels. We've more than doubled nitrogen fixation with enormous fertilizer use in commercial farming, and we've doubled the amount of phosphorus in coastal waters due to mining. Hopefully, understanding the delicacies of these cycles will help us see the importance of our inputs to them.
We are exploring the concepts of resilience and stability, using the mountain pine beetle as a case study. The Earth is currently undergoing a series of directional changes which lead to ecological changes. As a result, attempting to sustain stable ecosystems is a pressing question of our time. Population increase, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, and species extinction are only a few of the directional changes currently threatening our ecosystems. Latitude refers to the amount of change a system can endure before it loses its ability to recover to its current state. Resilience is a measure of the amount a system can absorb and adjust to while still maintaining its current functions and identity. The mountain pine beetle outbreak is questioning the resilience of trees in the Pacific Northwest, as seen in this figure, causing hundreds of acres of deforestation and causing ecosystems to become unstable.
In this case study, we observe the relationship between pine trees and mountain pine beetles. The pine trees are the autogenic engineers, or the foundation species, because they are the species that physically comprise the environment. The mountain pine beetles are the allogenic engineers because they take the autogenic engineer and physically deconstruct them into something different. Both species have coexisted for hundreds of years. The beetles will burrow in the pine trees while carrying a fungus that serves as food for larvae, which in return the beetles confer an antibiotic. The fungus can also cause the beetle to release pheromones to attract other beetles to the tree that it's currently located on. To counter this, the pine trees have a chemical-inducible defense in which they release sap containing oleoresin and terpenes from their phloem ducts that is toxic to any present beetles. Through the process of coevolution, beetles have been selected to have a higher oleoresin and terpene thresholds, thereby placing a selective pressure on the trees to mount quicker and stronger inducible responses. At controlled levels, the beetles can kill off the trees that aren't able to mount a response quickly and fully enough, while the trees can kill off beetles with lower tolerances. Under coexistence, we normally observe a gradual linear trend between the pest and host populations, but lately we have observed sudden jumps in the pest equilibrium density. This sudden jump is known as a hysteresis and is caused by an external variable. In this case, the shorter, milder winters have compromised the tree defenses so that the mountain pine beetles can now invade a larger selection of weakened trees and more quickly overwhelm their defenses. Afterwards, they release anti-aggregation pheromones to signal to other beetles to invade other trees and continue the process.
Resilience theory is easily depicted by this simple image, the valleys being stable states of a system and the balls representing the trees. Trees begin at a stable state, like this ball in a valley. The only way to change the state of the trees or ball is to disrupt it. The beetles change the stability of the system, and the trees end up in an alternative stable state. The ball ends up in another valley. In most cases, it is hard to return to the initial stable state because the alternative stable state requires more disruption than it originally did to get back over that hill. Thus, A to B does not equal B to A. Is this forest resistant to infestation, or is it resilient? Both. It is resilient because there are trees that are resistant to the infection, thus making the system as a whole resilient. Cases like this give way to new areas in science, such as landscape genomics. Infestations such as this give opportunity for selection. These trees resistant to infestation contain genes that give them this trait. And so if we are able to isolate these genes, we may be able to select for these and return these forests to state A using these genetically primed trees.
Island biogeography is a field of study focused on the factors that affect species richness in natural and human-dominated communities based on habitat isolation, area, and immigration and extinction dynamics. An island is an ecosystem surrounded by unlike ecosystems, can have freshwater or saltwater, and can be formed by changes in elevation. A mainland can be viewed as a very large island that is a source pool of species for nearby islands. Some habitats that can be considered islands include sky islands, kipukas, vernal pools, and even lakes. Islands can be used as models in species diversity and can explain mainland biodiversity patterns as well. Islands can be characterized by size and distance or isolation from the nearest similar habitat. For example, the species area effect describes that the relationship between species fitness and geographical area is positive. A 10-fold increase in area causes a 2-fold increase in species number. Islands can also be characterized by location in relation to the mainland. For instance, the distance from the mainland can affect the rate of colonization, remote islands farther from the mainland having fewer species than islands close to the mainland.
To be able to predict patterns of island biodiversity, we use 4 different assumptions. The first is that the mainland is the source pool of all species, all with similar immigration and extinction rates. The second is that the probability of colonization is proportional to island proximity to the mainland and to the island area. The third is that the colonization and extinction are independent of the species composition on the island. The fourth is that there are smaller populations are more likely to go extinct. Immigration rates to a new island are measured by the number of species colonizing the island per unit time. Immigration rate is maximized when there are no species on the island yet and is 0 when all potential colonizers are on the island. If an island is further from the mainland, the rate of immigration is lower. Extinction rate also varies with size, where small islands begin with large extinction rates due to less resources and more competition, and large islands begin with smaller extinction rates than small islands.
The island bug experiment by Simberloff and Wilson manipulated mangrove islands by fumigating the islands to get rid of the bugs, then checked the populations after 1 year. They found that the populations and species numbers were similar to what they had been before fumigation. They also found that islands closer to the source islands had a larger number of species. The rescue effect occurs when the island populations on large islands that are proximate to mainlands are rescued from extinction due to connectivity with the source pool. The target effect occurs when immigration of species target large islands due to more resources and available niches. Both of these effects explain patterns of species diversity and their relationship with island size. This is important in our global environment to promote species diversity and can be achieved by implementing larger and more closely spaced nature reserves, which preserve more species, as well as immigration corridors that allow safe immigration. Also, introducing source species can also recolonize areas where local extinction has already occurred.
Hi, I'm Anna, and Kat and I are going to talk to you about how some species are more equal than others. Species play three outsized roles as a keystone species, foundation species, or an ecosystem engineer. Foundation species make up the structure of the ecosystem, like trees in a forest or coral in a reef. There might be a lot of them, or they might contribute much of a system's biomass. A species can also be an ecosystem engineer, meaning its behavior modifies the composition of the area. We discussed beavers, but another example is elephants, keeping plains from becoming woodlands.
A keystone species can be defined as a species that has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to the abundance, biomass, or productivity. The removal of a keystone species causes the larger structure to collapse. Here we see a graph of keystone predation as a function of species diversity and predator density. When predator density is low, species diversity is driven up due to the prevention of competitive exclusion. There's a point in the hyperbolic curve where diversity begins to decrease as predators begin to eat all prey available.
This brings us to the green world hypothesis. We used to think the main influence on trophic levels was from the bottom, as lower levels provided the energy available to those above. But why then did consumers not devour all the resources available? Why were there still green leaves left on the trees? The answer: predators limit their prey's herbivory through top-down forcing. Part of one of the three ways keystone species can affect their ecosystem. They can control them either through top-down or bottom-up forcing. They can modify, as with habitat engineers. Or they can facilitate through pollination and seed dispersal.
Payne, in 1980, observed through perturbation studies that in Washington's intertidal zone, the starfish had a disproportionately large effect on the environment's species richness. Once the starfish were removed for 2 years, he noticed that the mussels took over the entire environment. Since we know starfish don't eat rockweed, the starfish must be influencing species richness through either direct predation, indirect competition, or a combination of both. Beavers are known to be keystone species, but are they also engineers or foundation species? Beavers are actually all three. They are foundation species because they harvest trees, thus removing undergrowth, and they are ecosystem engineers because in the process of clear-cutting trees and damming, they alter the ecosystem extensively. Through damming, they disproportionately affect species richness, which is why they are keystone species. Many species rely on either partly or entirely on beaver-created habitat, which directly controls species richness.
Species also serve as sentinels for their ecosystem. Polar bear populations have declined following lower productivity in the Arctic. This reflects the disproportionate effect human interference has had on apex consumers, as discussed in the paper assigned for this lecture. Like a canary in a coal mine, animals can act as warning signs for dangerous changes in the environment. An example of a species as a sentinel is the bald eagle. DDT, a pesticide, bioaccumulated in the eagle's food sources. It biomagnified through the eagle's food chain and decimated eagle populations. This warned the world about the dangers of DDT. So we should pay attention to these species. With them, we can not only better understand changing ecosystems, but we can also raise awareness of the consequences of our changing world.
Restoration ecology. What is it? Restoration ecology is basically rebuilding a functional ecosystem by renewing or restoring degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystems via human interaction, not to be confused with conservation biology, which is to preserve and maintain existing habitat and biodiversity. Furthermore, these two are different from restoration biology, which looks to restore populations so that they are able to persist and evolve within larger communities over time. So, is it gardening?
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Gardening serves more of an aesthetic purpose and works on a smaller scale, whereas restoration works on a larger scale and aims for economic function. Basically, there are two ways to restore damaged land. One way is to let nature restore itself. This can be done via succession, which is the idea that disturbed or empty space of land moves through a trajectory, from pioneer species to intermediate species to a climax community. And the other way is to intervene and restore it ourselves. We can do this with forest restoration, which is planting and replacing lost or needed trees, agroforestry, which involves improving rural landscapes by integrating trees on farms, or by boosting agricultural productivity on degraded lands. The restoration method is primed because we can easily monitor it. Basically, trees are really good facilitators.
Restoration can also be done in the water. For instance, river restoration can be done in many ways. In the example we discussed in class, ecologists fixed a river ladder so that more fish can find it and get up. This restored the functionality of the river. This is also primed for success because it can be easily monitored at all times. We can also restore different parts of the ocean. Global bleaching effects have bleached out a lot of coral, but luckily, bleached coral can recover. When we restore reefs, we try to transplant reproductive adults to get new larvae and build new reefs. This is because corals are animals that can regenerate by having reproductive adults that respawn and release larvae that can resettle.
Restoration can also be done via animals by transplanting them in safer places to preserve them. Sometimes we also transplant animals so that they may help the environment in which they are placed in. But of course, translocating species in terms of the assisted migration debate to see if their relocation gives them an increased possibility of survival can be quite controversial. Moving species to locations that promote their survival with proper resources poses a lower risk and more genetic selection for these species to survive. If species are relocated to areas outside their realm of comfort, then there is a much higher risk of these species to become isolated and ultimately extinct. And some examples are the common garden and the induced fragmentation effort. The common garden says that supercoral that thrive in warmer weather can be used as models to potentially help coral in other ways and not just transplantation. And the induced fragmentation effort says that if coral's connectivity is compromised by warming temperatures, then this restoration effort can help induce greater connectivity within the coral for later purposes.
Methods in Field Ecology by Zach and Pritam. Ecological techniques are used to study the biotic and abiotic components of ecosystems. Field ecologists investigate communities using random sampling techniques that aim to eliminate bias, reduce the effects of chance, and minimize errors in obtaining measurements and samples.
Trick number 1, learn how to randomize. The validity of results obtained from various sampling methods is dependent upon the adoption of random sampling techniques.
Trick number 2, learn how to identify organisms. This can be achieved using dichotomous keys, which consist of a series of choices one can make to easily identify different species.
Trick number 3, learn how to measure with nothing but your body. In other words, be resourceful. Ecologists must be resourceful. Learning to measure with your body allows you to always produce estimations.
Trick number 4, learn how to count quickly. Many field ecologists use hand clickers or practice the application of visual bins.
Trick number 5, learn how to use a transect tape. Lay out the transect line straight and even. This is useful when sampling a habitat that has species in transition, and a line transect is one in which all individual organisms touching the line are recorded.
Trick number 6, learn how to use a quadrat. Quadrats are used to investigate the distribution of species. Square quadrat frame are for determining population densities, or the number of individuals per square meter. A subdivided quadrat frame is used for determining percent cover of species, which measures the extent to which different species occupy subdivided quadrats or a point quadrat. Using a subdivided quadrat frame, we can also determine frequency of occurrence.
Trick number 7, combine transects and quadrats. This is commonly known as a belt transect. Quadrat and transect sampling are commonly used techniques for determining distribution within sessile communities like plants, fungi, and benthic invertebrates.
Trick number 8. Question yourself. What question are you trying to ask in your experiment?
Trick number 9. Match your method to your question. Based on the answer to the above question, determine if overall design of study is correct or makes sense. For example, would it make sense to use a quadrat or a transect design to measure blank? There are a variety of abiotic measurement tools like light meters and pH meters that help to create specific components of the experiment.
Trick number 10. Learn how to visualize and analyze your data. One can design a scheme or picture to visualize the study itself. One can also use charts or graphs and other visual aids to summarize their data. Thank you for listening.
What is conservation biology? Conservation biology strives to preserve and maintain existing habitats and biodiversity, mitigate climate change, and preserve endangered species. Conservation biology overlaps with other disciplines, mainly restoration biology and restoration ecology. Conservation biology was founded in the early 1980s by a group of ecologists that strove to objectively look at the changes in the environment while understanding its place within a larger social context. How should ecologists approach conservation biology? Ecologists focus on the value of biodiversity, patterns of decline and major threats to biodiversity, and conservation planning and prioritization. While focusing on all these key points, it's important for ecologists to remember human dependency on ecosystem services in terms of water purification and soil formation, as well as acknowledging that people use domesticated and wild species for food, fuel, and medicine, along with many other things. Two major organizations have developed to further conservation efforts: the Society for Conservation Biology and International Union for Conservation of Native and Natural Resources.
So why has conservation ecology become more relevant in the past few decades? It's because issues like anthropogenic climate change induced by greenhouse gas emissions and plastic pollution have emerged only 2 centuries ago, and these problems have been shown to harm the populations of many species. However, it has been found that even prehistoric human hunters have been contributing to biodiversity decline long before the advent of industrial practices, and this has only just accelerated since then. The biggest factors leading to modern biodiversity decline are habitat loss and degradation, the introduction of invasive species, and overexploitation of ecosystem resources. Habitat loss involves the conversion of one habitat type to another, degradation reduces the quality of a habitat's resources, and fragmentation breaks up continuous landscape to smaller fragments. The introduction of invasive species is often to the detriment of native species because invasives can often be better competitors. The native species that are most vulnerable are usually specialist species that have a narrower, realized niche. Additionally, the principal threats to biodiversity vary between biomes. While not all biomes are equally susceptible to the same threats, all biomes have expressed a recent decline in biodiversity due to 2 factors: pollution and climate change.
So how do we go about conservation? The fine filter approach focuses on genes, species, and populations. The coarse filter approach focuses on landscape, ecosystem, and habitat. Every approach must consider the precautionary principle, which says to avoid acting until you can prove there's no unacceptable danger. Don't avoid innovation, simply go slow and ask smart questions. One way to approach these questions is with the PVA, which is a demographic model that weighs options for population survival. And there are many different options. Protecting a surrogate species helps protect another species in the habitat. Flagship species are charismatic species that can easily obtain support from the public. Umbrella species are species that shield other species. Indicator species help us assess disturbance and monitor trends. Focal species have particular ecological requirements or vulnerabilities. Conservation can also be directed towards habitats, such as habitats with high biodiversity. So there are a lot of different ways to approach conservation, and we have seen success with these different approaches. Just one man managed to save New Zealand's cockapoo parrots from near extinction. The most important thing is to not lose hope when it comes to conservation. We can make a difference.
Climate change is a 3-legged stool. It involves rising temperatures, ocean acidification, and rising sea levels. There are many directional changes in the drivers of ecological processes, including rising population, rising atmospheric CO2, and increased land conversions and species exploitation. All of these things are changing at once, and they're all related to each other.
Worldwide, 2016 was the warmest year on record. Before that, 2015 was the warmest year on record. In fact, 16 out of the past 17 years have been named as the warmest years in recorded history. Based on current trends, it is now expected that 2017 will top 2016 as the warmest year. Due to human activities such as deforestation and the burning of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have increased dramatically over time. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, the rate of CO2 increase has shown no signs of stopping. From 1960 to 2010, the concentration of carbon dioxide increased from approximately 310 ppm to 380 ppm. April 2014 marked a significant moment in human history because it was the first month where carbon dioxide concentrations reached the 400 ppm threshold.
Due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere, more CO2 is taken in by the oceans. This is causing ocean acidification. There has been a 0.15 drop on the pH scale since pre-industrial levels. This corresponds to a 32% increase in acidity, although the water is still above pH of 7. With more CO2 in the ocean, there are less carbonate ions available for calcifying species like oysters and clams to build their calcium carbonate shells, which disrupts the marine food web.
There are two ways of dealing with the problem of climate change: adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation means adjusting to the changes, moderating possible damage, and coping with the consequences of increasing CO2 concentrations. Mitigation means attempting to permanently reduce or eliminate the risks of climate change. There are two approaches to mitigating the effects of climate change. Reactive approaches deal with the problem after it has happened. One such approach is carbon sequestration, which includes air capture and scrubbing, subterranean burial, and ocean fertilization. Proactive approaches prevent the problem from happening in the first place and include reducing emissions, reforestation, localizing production of goods, and using alternative energy sources.
Sea levels have dramatically risen due to increasing temperatures. Higher temperatures continue to melt tons of glacier ice near the polar ice caps. However, the shores can't hold all that water, and therefore coastal regions are getting flooded. There's of course uncertainty with the projection models of climate change. However, even the lowest models predict devastating consequences. With only an increase in 2 degrees, Back Bay will be completely flooded by the year 2500.
Climate change such as extreme weathers, desertification or drought, islands submerged, and hurricanes also induce species migration and facilitate species invasion. The species invasion happens not only on land but also in oceans. With humans shipping goods globally, it makes species invasion more easily and more complicated. The competition between invasive species and native species could change the ecosystem structure and contribute to a loss in biodiversity.